Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to another free TESOL webinar for teachers. This evening we've got Kieran Donaghy joining us, who we're very, very happy to have with us this evening. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic webinar. I've got a couple of things to tell you about, one of which is that we have our next webinar is now booked for November the 22nd, which is also a Thursday. And this time is going to be at 1 o'clock at lunchtime, Spain time. And we've got Robin Walker joining us from Oviedo. And he's going to be talking about imaging pronunciation from sight to sound. Okay, so that sounds like a very interesting webinar. I'll post the link in the chat a little bit later on, maybe at the end of today's webinar, for those of you who want to sign up already. So that's Thursday, November the 22nd at 1 o'clock, just after lunch or just before lunch, depends on if you want a Spanish lunch or an English lunch, with Robin Walker. Okay, and it's quite an interesting webinar because Robin is going to be quite involved in our convention in March. He's going to be running a Pron-Sig strand in the convention in Oviedo. So it will be kind of like an introduction to some of the things that they'll be talking about in that strand. And just to remind you that our convention will be held in the second weekend of March. I think it's the 8th to the 10th of March in Oviedo this year. So we'd love to see you all there. We've got our plenary speakers already confirmed. We've got David Marsh, JJ Wilson, and Teresa Ting. So we've got some excellent plenary speakers for you to see this year. And I'd like to introduce Kieran a little bit today as well. Kieran's going to talk to us about the image in English language teaching. Kieran is a wonderful speaker, a very experienced speaker, who has won awards for his work. He's got, I'm sure you've all seen it and used it. I certainly have. His website, Film English, which he won an Elton's Award for, which is full of amazing resources based around short videos that you can use in class. I've used lots of them and highly recommend it. And he's also published a lot of books based on using films, using videos, and using images in the classroom, including this one, which I'm hoping he's going to talk about today because it's a wonderful book. He edited that book, and I really recommend getting hold of a copy if you can, because it's a really useful and practical guide to using images in the language classroom. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kieran. Let me see if I can unmute you, Kieran, and put your video on. Okay, how are we doing? Can you turn your video on, Kieran?
Yeah, just 1 second. Hi.
We can hear you, so I can hear you. So
yeah.
I'm assuming everybody can hear you.
Okay.
So
just 1 second. I don't seem to be able to unmute. 1 second.
Video. I might be able to do it for you.
1 second.
Yeah, I can do it.
I think it's yes.
Thank you. Right, so welcome. Very much looking forward to today's webinar, and thank you very much for agreeing to do this for us. And over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mandy, for the lovely introduction and for hosting the event, and thank you to Tesol-Spain for inviting me to speak. So good evening to everyone who's attending. So as sorry, I'm just trying to get my presentation here. I can't see my presentation, and if I can't see it, I imagine that you can't see it either. So if Mandy, would it be possible to share my, sorry, I've just got to share my screen.
Yeah, can you see it? Perfect, yes, we can see it now. Brilliant.
You can see it now, yeah?
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay.
Leave you to it.
I can't, sorry, just 1 second, please, because I can't see it. Okay, just give me 1 second, please. I'm just trying to work out.
Okay, we can see
So,
you, Kieran. Can you see?
I can't. Sorry, something's happened that I can't see my presentation. Okay, just one second, please. Okay, I can now.
Brilliant. I'll leave you.
Okay. Okay, so so good evening to everyone who's attending, and as Mandy said, I'm going to be talking about the image in English language teaching, which, as Mandy also mentioned, is the title of this book, The Image in English Language Teaching, which I co-edited with Daniel Cherry last year. And this book is, we published this book to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Image Conference, which is, as far as I know, the only conference in the world exclusively on the use of images in language education. And I'm the founder and organizer of this conference. The 5th edition of the conference was held in Valletta, Malta. It was hosted by the ELT Council in Valletta, and we decided to create a book which was 20 chapters, all of the chapters written by people who had spoken at the first 5 editions of the Image Conference, and a lot of well-known teacher trainers and writers such as Ben Goldstein, Paul Dummett, Antonia Clare, Anna Witcher, Silvia Carastapi. All of these people contributed chapters to the book, and we came up with a book of 20 chapters. We're very, very happy that we got a preface by Gunter Kress, who's somebody who's a bit of a hero of mine, probably one of the founders of multimodality and multiliteracy pedagogy, which we'll be speaking about a little bit later. A lot of people, when they see the book, they comment how much they like the painting, the cover on the book, and this is actually a painting by one of the writers, Emma Louise Pratt, who's also a very talented artist. And the book covers many, many facets of the use of image in language education. Just before I start, what I would like to do is just to ask people if you use images in your classrooms, and if you use images, what types of images do you use? Perhaps you could add something to the chat there if you use images, and what images you use. I can't actually see the chat, but I imagine that you are writing yes. I certainly hope so, and I imagine that you're saying that you use many different types of images. I think it would be difficult nowadays to imagine the language classroom without images. We've got coursebook images, photos, paintings, YouTube videos, films, short films, comics, flashcards, memes, and increasingly student-created artwork and media. So very much that images are used a lot in language education, and many teachers are very enthusiastic about this. But I'm just going to ask this question, that despite the fact that images that we have, despite the ubiquity of images, I'd like to ask the question whether the images that we see in course books and the images which are being used in the classroom, are they being approached as an aid and a support or decoration, or a support for vocabulary learning, for example, or are they being approached as a significant component of communicating in a foreign language? Are we using them as a means of fostering the student's communicative competence? So that's very much the question that I'm going to be asking today. And by doing that, I'm going to look a little bit at the past use of images in the language classroom, the present use of images in the language classroom, and perhaps some trends and the future of the use of image in the language classroom. I think if we look at images in the use of images in the language classroom, it's important to look at how images are approached in resource books, in methodology books. And there's probably one work which is probably, in many ways, the seminal work of resource books related to images, and it's this book from 1966, so quite a long time back, The Visual Element in Language Teaching by Stephen Pitt-Corder. Now, and Pitt-Corder was the first person I would say, certainly published, who made the distinction between, as you can see there, talking about images, which would be merely describing images, and talking with images, and this would be responding personally to images, a more creative and critical approach to using images. As I said, I'd say that this book had a huge influence on English language teaching, and in many ways it inspired a lot of the resource books which followed it. And now I'm just going to give you some of the resource books which I've used related to images, and it's a little bit of a history of my language teaching life, as it were. When I first started teaching in 1989 in Madrid, many moons ago, this was one of the first methodology books which I used. This was a book published in 1980 by, as you see, Alan Maley, Alan Duffy, and Francois Grelet. And this was a book which took a very, very creative and an original approach to using image. A lot of the older teachers will remember this. The younger teachers probably not so much. It's out of print now, but it's an excellent book. So that was one of the first books that I used, and I think it was excellent. Jumping forward quite a bit to 2009, Bernstein's working with images. I would say in many ways this book is a seminal work. Proposed that teachers looked at visual literacy and multimodality when thinking about how they could use images, and this book definitely takes a critical and creative approach to using images in the classroom. It's a very, very good course book and one of my personal favourites. Another excellent resource book published again in 2009, English Through Art. Again, this is a resource book which is taking a very critical, very creative approach to using images in the language classroom. And I would say that this book, along with Ben's, the approach is very much using images to foster students' communicative competence and creativity. So I would say there are a number of really excellent resource books related to the use of the still image in language education. Just going to turn quickly to resource books related to moving images in the language classroom. Perhaps the most influential methodology book for teachers is this book, Video, by Richard Cooper, Mike Lavery, and Mario Rinvolucri, published in 1990. And I would say in many ways, and this was the first book that actually watching a video and answering listening comprehension questions, students played a much more active role, and a much more, I would say, much more creative role in many ways. And I think this book had again a huge influence on the subsequent resource books related to the use of moving image. I'm going to refer to some of the ones which for me personally have had an impact on the way that I've viewed images and used images in the classroom and also in my writing. Film by Susan Steplensky and Barry Tomalin really is an excellent book. and one of the first resource books which has approached film literacy, cine literacy in depth. It focuses mainly on feature-length films and trailers, but it doesn't focus on short films. I personally am much more interested in using short films in the language classroom. So in some ways, this book is a little bit, although it's an excellent book and lots of the activities can be used still in the language classroom, I would say it's a little bit outdated because the focus is on feature-length films, and I find it a little bit difficult to justify the use of feature-length films in the language classroom. I certainly propose, I would recommend students watching feature-length films outside the classroom, but I'm not sure we can justify it inside the classroom. I'm much more in favour of using short films and short videos, but an excellent resource book published in 2001. This is another one, Using Authentic Video in the Language Classroom by Jane Sherman. Again, the approach is about using video to help to foster students' communicative competence. Highly recommended. More recent and a really excellent book, again by Ben Goldstein, this time with Paul Driver, Language Learning with Digital Video. And this was perhaps the first resource book which dealt with using online video in the classroom. So using videos from YouTube, from Vimeo, so exploiting this material, this visual material which already exists, but also, and perhaps this is where the real innovation is here, also lots of activities where students create their own visual text, their own multimodal text, their own short films, their own videos, which I think is very much where we're going. So I would highly recommend this. And I also have my own methodology book, Film in Action, which is in some ways is similar to the approach of Ben and Paul. But perhaps the difference is here, I'm focusing more on short films here, they're focusing more on short videos, but there's also lots of activities where students are the creators of the media as well, not just the consumers of the media. So I would say that with just to summarize with the methodology books, there are lots and lots of excellent methodology books out there, both for still images and for moving images. Having said that, there is a slight problem. Methodology books sell very, very few copies. Nobody ever got rich by writing methodology books. Most methodology books in their lifetime will probably sell a few hundred copies, 1,000 if it's popular. If it's incredibly popular, perhaps a few thousand. You're certainly not going to get rich on 10% royalties from a methodology book. But these methodology books don't sell very much, but the writers of the much better selling course books, many of the writers do read these methodology books and then use the activities suggested in the methodology books in their own writing. So eventually the perhaps more innovative and creative activities in the resource books come into, in the resource books come into the course books. And I think that we have to recognize have a huge impact on teachers' methodology. And I know for in Spain that the course books have a huge impact on methodology, the teacher's methodology. So we need to look at how images are approached in course books. I'm going to show you a quote here now. Peter Viney, who is a well-known course book writer. He's the course book writer of Streamline and Grapevine. When I first started teaching in 1989 in Madrid, Streamline was the series which was used in the school that I worked at, and it was very, very popular in Spain, as in many other parts of the world. And he wrote Streamline and also Grapevine. This is, if you just read this quote here from Peter, So as you see, Peter angered a group of teachers in Japan by suggesting that Headway had had a greater influence on what happens in the ELT classroom than the entire collected works of Stephen Krasson. I would agree 100% with Peter, and applying Peter's point to our own context here in Spain, I would argue that English File has had a much greater impact on what happens in the ELT classroom in Spain than the entire collected works of Scott Thornbury. For better or for worse, the course books have a huge impact on what happens in the language classroom. A lot of teachers are not reading resource books. Resource books are selling fewer and fewer copies every year. And I think I'm somebody who's very much in favour of course books. I like course books in many ways. But in some ways, I think that the course books are perhaps too good in the sense that they have so many resources that teachers, some teachers, or quite a lot of teachers, are not actually using any other resources besides their course book and the additional resources which come with the pack of the course book. And a lot of teachers are not necessarily doing what you're doing today and coming to, watching a webinar on a Thursday evening. They are using English File, they are using the teacher's book, they're using the photocopyable materials. They're not really accessing resource books. They're perhaps not up to date with the most recent cutting edge methodology. Peter's explanation for this is, as he says, course books are the filter through which theory reaches the classroom. The good ideas trickle through. So I think there are a lot of good ideas in the course books, but it takes a long time for them, as Peter says, to trickle through. From my own personal perspective, I would say that when we look at the use of still images in ELT course books, I'm certainly struck by the fact that the power of images to stimulate ideas, discussion, and creativity is still currently underexploited in the majority of course books. Certainly, I would say for young adults and adults, perhaps that I think they're perhaps exploited more for younger learners, but certainly I would say for the majority of course books for young adults and adults, the power of the images to stimulate ideas, discussion, creativity are underexploited at the moment. I'm going to use a quote from Ben Goldstein to back up this point. Ben Goldstein is a very well-known coursebook writer. If I just give you that quote for a few seconds just to read that quote, it's rather a long quote, but if you just read that quote and if you agree or disagree with it. So Ben's argument here is that images are used to make the product, the book is the product, more attractive and marketable. This is perfectly understandable. We would want, I would say, aesthetically pleasing course book. He's saying that most of the images are largely archive photos. I would say that is the case. Ben was writing in 2009. There has been a slight shift. I'll come to that in a little bit later, but I would say this is still the case. He says these images are unoriginal. I would agree with him. The use of archive images, for example, from Getty, it's not very original. And he's also saying that they promote an affluent and aspirational lifestyle to learners. I would certainly agree with that as well. Ben, the quote continues, if you just read that, please. Perhaps think about whether you agree or not with that. Ben's criticism here is that the images in course books, I would say, are sanitized. They look like a color supplement, as he says there. And also that they perhaps don't represent the images which both students and teachers encounter in the real world. It's a safe, cleaned up version, a sanitized version. So this is often a criticism which is towards the use of images certainly in young learner and adult course books. And in addition to this criticism of the images being sanitized and not the types of images which students encounter in the real world, there's also the criticism that images are still being used as aids or for decoration. They're just used for decorative purposes or as an aid for learning vocabulary. So if students are going to learn the item bottle, you have a bottle there. So it's used as an aid, perfectly justifiable. But it's decorations and aids. One would have thought perhaps that in sort of 2018, this may have changed. Perhaps it's changed somewhat. In quite a recent study, in 2015, so only 3 years ago, a study of 3 intermediate young adults and adult course books, David A. Hill found that over half of the photos and drawings were used only for decoration. We've got the quote from the study here. So David argues that this is a waste of effort on the part of the publisher, and he sees it as a wasted opportunity for the language learner and the teacher as well. And certainly that we do need images as aids, definitely, but perhaps we can have a more critical and creative and more challenging use of images in the classroom. However, I think despite the fact that the majority of course books still use images largely for support and decoration, I would say that recently there has been a trend towards using images to stimulate ideas, discussion and creativity in a number of course books. And I would say in an increasing number of course books, such as Life, National Geographic. This is from a unit of Life. I think it's intermediate. And what we have, each unit starts with a high impact, non-stock photo, which is used as a springboard to help students establish the topic, activate schemata, and get students talking. So this image here that you can see, I think it does make an impact here. And then we have the instruction. Look at the title of the article, the photo and map. What do you think the article is about? So definitely here, the use of the image here is they're establishing the topic, they're activating the schemata, they're getting students talking. So Life, National Geographic have been doing this very successfully. Another course book which I think has done this successfully is The Big Picture. Again, by Ben Goldstein, this time with Kerry Jones and Daniel Barber. So there is, I would say, a definite trend to using images to stimulate ideas, discussion, and creativity. When we look at the use of videos in course books, and now increasingly, I'd say it's very difficult now to find a course book which doesn't integrate video into the course. When we look at the use of video still today, I would argue that largely video is used as glorified listening. It's used as a way of doing listening comprehension, but with the support of moving images to help non-verbal communication. You can see the quotation here from Daniel and myself from the image in English language teaching. most of the time when I look at video activities in course books, most of the activities are there for the activities are language-based activity. I'd say this is a shame. I think that we can be using other types of activities, not just for language, but also for more communicative and creative tasks in which students are encouraged to interpret and analyse what they see. And again, I think there is a clear trend towards these more communicative and creative tasks. And in fact, in some course books, students are even being asked to create their own videos, which I think is a very, very positive move. So generally this is aimed at young learners and young adults to create the types of text, the multimodal text that students are engaging with outside the classroom. We're bringing that to the classroom and getting them to create these types of text. A course book where I know this is being done on cover, this is a Cambridge University Press course book. Students are asked to create their own videos for homework as well, which I think I see as something very positive. What I would say is just in the same way that the still image is beginning to play a more dominant and active role, so too has video become more integral to classroom practice and become to play a more communicative and creative role. Having said that, I would say that although there's been a gradual shift towards a more critical and creative use of both still and moving images in ELT course books and in the ELT classroom, images are still not being fully exploited as multimodal text, and there's little focus on multiliteracy's pedagogy, as well as little effort to develop students' visual literacy. And these are two things that I'd like to look at very, very briefly, but I think it's important for us just to go through what multiliteracy's pedagogy is and what visual literacy is and how this relates to the language classroom. Now, so we're going to look at this at multiliteracy's pedagogy, and when we look at multiliteracy's pedagogy, perhaps the key person here is Gunter Kress, and Gunter Kress is the person who I mentioned earlier, who wrote the preface for the book, The Image in English Language Teaching. So Daniel and I were delighted when we got Daniel to when we got Gunter to write the preface. The term multiliteracies, it was coined in the mid-1990s by the New London Group, and this is a group of scholars of which Gunter was a prominent member, and they argued that literacy pedagogy should be linked to the rapidly changing social, cultural and technological environment. And their argument was that for a long period of time, the book was the dominant medium of communication. But however, at the end of the 21st century, at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, with the ascendance of the image, particularly the moving image, the screen has now replaced the book as the dominant medium of communication. And we have a quote here from Gunter Kress, from his I'd say seminal work, Literacy in the New Media Age. If you just read that quote, please. So I think it's a beautiful piece of writing there, that, you know, sort of the former constellation of medium of book and mode of writing is giving way, and in many domains has already given way. I think this is undoubtedly true, has already given way to the new constellation of medium of screen and mode of image. Multimodal texts have taken over from print text in many domains. So in Literacy in the New Media Age, Kress offers a new theory of literacy. And he argues that we need to combine language-based theory with semiotics and other visual theories to provide an appropriate meaning to the term literacy in the 21st century, that literacy is no longer just reading and writing, it's many, many other things. Another prominent member of the New London group is Carrie Jewett, and she puts it in these terms here. You know, so that literacy practices are as an intertextual web of contexts and technologies. So again, that literacy is not just reading and writing. There are many, many other things. Now that communication is primarily multimodal, this has to be taken into account when we define literacy. And what Kerry was proposing, an educational framework that helps students to read and write the multimodal and visual texts that they meet every day. And this is a simplification, but in essence, this is what multi-literacy pedagogy is about, that students learn how to read. This means to analyze and interpret multimodal texts, and to write to create multimodal texts. These are the majority of texts which they're meeting are multimodal texts, so they need to be able to read these texts, and that means to analyze, interpret these texts, and they need to be able to write these texts to create these texts. So within the framework of multiliteracy's pedagogy, which Carrie Jewett was referring to, visual literacy is one of the key literacies, and we're just going to look at visual literacy very, very briefly now. We have a definition of visual literacy, which I'll ask you to read, which I think is an excellent definition. If you could just read it for a few seconds, and I'll tell you why I like it. So, as Maria says here, what I like about this is a group of largely acquired abilities that we learn these abilities. And again, talking about the ability to understand, to read images, the ability to use and create images, and also this ability to think and learn in terms of image. I would say that visual literacy, the importance of visual literacy in education is widely acknowledged, and that there is a gradual move away from a reliance on print as the primary medium of dissemination and instruction, and a move towards visual media and the screen. And there's an increasing recognition that visual literacy needs to be integrated into curricula. Now, this recognition that visual literacy needs to be integrated into the curricula, I think this is reflected by the fact that in three countries with very advanced educational systems, Singapore, Canada, and Australia, they've added 2 new skills to their English language curricula, the traditional skills of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. They've added 2 new skills of viewing and representing. And for me, this is a game changer. The fact that these new skills of viewing and representing are actually in curricula in 3 countries now, and I'm sure in the near future, will be integrated in curricula in countries throughout the world. For me, this is a game changer. We're going to look very, very briefly at what we mean by viewing. This is the definition of viewing from the Canadian Common Curriculum Framework. As you see there, the key words there, I would say active process of attending to and comprehending visual media, and we've got some examples there of visual media. We could add some more, but I think the important thing there is active process of attending to and comprehending. So viewing therefore requires learners to construct meaning by interpreting the parts, the images, the symbols, the conventions, the contexts that are related to a visual text, and to understand not only what a text says, but also how the text works. So very much about an active process. And here we have, again, from the Canadian Common Curriculum Framework, effective viewers would ask themselves these questions. I think this is a fantastic framework, and this framework could be adapted quite easily to the English language classroom. What is the text representing? How is the text constructed? What's the purpose of a text? To whom is the text directed? Who does the text exclude? These generic questions which could be applied to any multimodal text, any visual text. So I think this is a very, very useful framework here. If we look at representing now, we have again the definition from the Canadian Common Curriculum Framework. Enables students to communicate information, ideas through a variety of media. Okay, so it's about communicating information, ideas through a variety of media. Quite a simple but effective definition. If we look at some examples of this, so it says representing enables students to communicate their ideas visually using a variety of medium and formats, and we've got some of the formats, medium formats here. I imagine that a lot of you here today already are using these medium formats in your classroom. These medium formats are being used in the English language classroom throughout the world, but I would suggest that we need to use them more. What's very, very interesting there, that last sentence I think is fantastic, that representing often allows students to make sense of their learning and to demonstrate their understanding. I think this is absolutely vital here, and there's lots of studies which back up that representing by students creating their own media, by creating their own artwork, it helps them to make sense of their learning and it demonstrates their understanding. Okay, so I think undoubtedly these two new skills of viewing and representing, as I said earlier, will be integrated into English language curricula throughout the world in the near future. However, for the moment at least, I would say that very little attention has been paid to them in English language teaching syllabus design. For the moment, very little attention has been paid to them. And I would say that multimodality and visual literacy have been largely ignored in English language teaching, unfortunately. Again, I've got a quote here from Gunter Kress. Now, this is from 2000, so I mean, it's 18 years ago. Things have changed somewhat, but not a great deal, I would say. And as Gunter says here, you know, most of the texts that he looks at are multimodal. They have at least two modes of communication. There's the language as writing and the image. There may be other modes as well. But he says that this is largely ignored in ELT. This is from 2000, so you perhaps could argue this is a little bit outdated, but I've got a quote from a colleague of mine, a friend and colleague, Syria Karastathi, from 2016. And this is, if you just read this, please. Sylvia's talking about her experience of going to conference, and she's really impressed with the amount of digital tools, digital media, which are presented at conferences, so iPads, films, digital storytelling, interactive whiteboards. This is very, very positive. It's exciting and it's positive. And she says, as a useful tool that promotes engagement and new. Excuse me then. Sorry, my dog was trying to get into the study there. Sorry. So as Sylvia says, that it's a useful tool that promotes engagement and new learning opportunities. So this is very positive, the way that the ELT community has embraced digital technology. But Sylvia continues here. I'm not sure if you read that, perhaps think if you agree with this. So despite the fact that we've got all of these digital tools, the media which they produce is generally visual media. However, visual literacy is largely ignored in the conferences. So it's a little bit of a paradox here. We've got all of these digital tools, we've got this visual media, but largely visual literacy and multimodality is ignored. And it's, as Sylvia, I think, rightly says here, often subsumed under the focus of digital literacies. With this focus more on digital literacies, so I would say it's a sort of, as Sylvia says there, a misinterpretation of its changing role, an increasingly important role, the increasingly important role of visual literacy in language education. With Sylvia, visual literacy and multimodality are largely ignored in English language teaching. Highlights the need for teachers to receive training in both visual literacy and media production. Sylvia says there, we want to empower teachers in an era of multimodal communication, enable better collaboration with students. So I would argue that unless teachers receive specific training in visual literacy and media production, it'll be difficult for them to teach vital skills to students in a world where they're expected to interpret and present complex ideas using a variety of media. And very much that the nature of communication, of contemporary communication, has changed. It's mainly multimodal in nature, and that we have to rethink what it means to communicate competently in a world where most of the communication is multimodal in nature. I'm coming towards the end of my talk, and perhaps paradoxically, in a talk about visual literacy and multimodality, I haven't used so many multimodal texts, but I'd like to change that. I'm just going to show you two films, very, very short films, which I created with my colleague Anna Witcher. Anna and I created these films together, and perhaps in many ways these two short films are a summary and a complement to what I've been talking about today. So I just ask you to watch this first film, and just perhaps to reflect on that. If you might like to comment on it in the chat box. Okay, so I think that the film in some ways supports what I've been talking about today. Anna and I are referring specifically to filmmaking in language education, but it could be other media, other types of media creation. And I think this perhaps is a summary and supports, complements in some ways what I've been talking about today. So perhaps if you just watch this film, as you're watching this film, how this film makes you, how it makes you feel, and perhaps some thoughts on it, which perhaps we could discuss afterwards. Okay, so I would say that perhaps this would summarize the message of the film. We have to slow down, reflect, think about what we're seeing, why it's there, how it affects us, what it does to us emotionally, and why we're constantly bombarded with images. Perhaps we need to reflect on this. So this is related to visual literacy. Perhaps we could, if you've got any questions about that, you can ask me them afterwards. So I'd just like to conclude here. So basically, a lot of teachers are doing excellent work with images. A lot of writers are doing excellent work with images. But I think that we need, ELT needs to come to terms with multimodality, with multiliteracies, pedagogy and visual literacy. And we need to do that if we want to meet the needs of our students to communicate in a world where communication is increasingly multimodal in nature. I think we really need to do this. How we can do this, 3 things that I would suggest: increase the presence of multimodal texts in the ELT curricula, so having more multimodal texts in course books, for example. incorporate specific visual literacy and media production into pre-service and in-service teacher training. I think this is absolutely essential, and specific visual literacy and media production strategies aimed at students. Those would be the three things that I would suggest. I'm going to give you, you've got my email address there, you've got the addresses of my websites there. If there are, thank you very much for watching. If there are any, if Amanda has any questions from the chat, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, we do have a question from the chat. Nabila asked, where can we get a copy of the Canadian Common Curricular Framework?
Yeah, if you search online, you'll find it. You'll find it online. Yeah, so you just put, if you put that into, I can't remember the year, you'll find it. If you just put it into Google, you'll find it. I got it online.
Fantastic, thank you.
I haven't got the actual link here, but it's quite easy to find.
Okay, great. And well, we'd like to thank Nero for his guest appearance.
Thank you.
And would you be able to send us links or tell us where we can find those two videos that we watched at the end of the presentation?
Yes, I can. I can indeed. Yes, I can indeed.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, I can also, sorry, I can also send you a link to where you can download the book, The Image in English Language Teaching. I can send you a link.
Send them to me. I get the email addresses of everyone who's been here today, and I'll forward them on, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, I think that was it. Okay, anybody else got a question before we say goodbye? Everybody's saying thank you in the chat, Kieran.
Okay, okay.
I'm not going to switch my video on because my internet connection is a little bit dodgy, and I don't want to kind of overload it and get cut off.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm still incognito here. Okay, so if there's no more questions, then I'd just like to say thank you very much. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else has. I need to start using a lot more multimodal things in my classes, definitely, and I've got some ideas now to do that, so that's great. Oh, hang on, there's something in the Q&A. Oh, just a thank you. Somebody said thank you. So everybody said thank you. Thank you from Tesol-Spain as well, Kieran, for being with us this
Pleasure.
week. And see you in Oviedo, we hope.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so.
And see everybody else there in Oviedo too, I hope. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.